18th, 2003, and the USA, with some of its allies, has led a full-scale invasion on Iraq. And the reason for this invasion is that the USA claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, had links with terrorists, and also was developing nuclear weapons.
The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use them against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
But you see, everything leading to this invasion was not what it was.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb.
Nuclear weapon, nuclear weapon, nuclear weapon.
Active chemical munitions bunkers, mobile production facilities.
We know he's got chemical weapons. He's got them, he's got them, he's got them.
Let me explain. On July of 2002, Richard Dialov, who was the head of MI6, travels to New York. In New York, he holds a secret meeting with the CIA director George Tenet. The subject of this meeting was Saddam Hussein and Iraq. This secret meeting was later summarized to a confidential memo which was presented to the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. But this memo will later be leaked to British journalist Michael Smith, and this is what we have here: the secret Downing Street memo. The memo exposes how Bush and his people were fixated on removing Saddam Hussein from power no matter what. This memo goes ahead to show how Bush and his people really wanted their war, and they had no patience with following the UN process, and that the aftermath of this military action was not given so much thought. The memo also is evidence of how facts were being made to justify this invasion. This is not just a story about a war. It is a story of how powerful few individuals are and how they ultimately had their way. During the 80s, Saddam was a useful friend of the US when he was at war with Iran, which was an enemy of the US. But Saddam would later turn into a headache in the region. He created instability in the region, and this instability was threatening the US interest in the region, particularly access to oil. You see, after 9/11 attacks, the US needed to react. This would be the right time to attack Iraq. Bush would describe Iraq as an evil, and he further warned that the price of indifference would be catastrophic.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
The seal of the war was in full swing, and not just in the US.
Mr. Speaker, I've never put the justification for action as regime change. I accept fully that those opposed to this course of action share my detestation of Saddam. Who could not? If this House now demands that at this moment, faced with this threat from this regime, that British troops are pulled back, that we turn away at the point of reckoning, and this is what it means, what then? What will Saddam feel? Strengthened beyond measure.
On another leaked memo, the British Prime Minister Tony Blair is seen assuring his friend Bush that even though the war would ultimately be dangerous, he would concentrate on the political context, and that was to make sure that the war happens. You see, there are two stories here. One, which is what these leaked documents shows, and second is what Bush and his people sold to the public. Behind secret doors, the USA wanted to show its might, especially after the 9/11 attacks, and this was in contrast to what the USA was selling to the public. To sell the war to the public, they claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
That Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
Bush and his allies would go ahead to claim that the weapons of mass destruction were to be used against the US and its
There is
allies.
no doubt that he is amassing them to use them against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
The majority of the American people trusted the president, and why shouldn't they? He had spent the better part of the last year giving them every reason why we should invade Iraq.
I take the threat very seriously. I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously. I know for a fact that he's poisoning his own people. I will remind them that history has called us into action, that we love freedom, that we'll be deliberate, patient, strong in the values that we adhere to. But we can't let the world's worst leaders blackmail, threaten, hold freedom-loving nations hostage with the world's worst weapons.
The UK House of Commons report on Iraq quotes that there was limited intelligence on Iraq and that the defectors, exiles, and the US, which the intelligence was heavily relied on, had agendas of their own. Another US report on Iraq's state of WMDs revealed that analytic assumptions and judgment were heavily relied on rather than hard evidence. In short, there was no evidence that Iraq had WMDs. The Chilcot inquiry established that there was no links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. These world leaders knew this, but they still sold this war. There was no evidence on why Iraq was to be invaded. To get approval from Congress for use of military action against Iraq, Bush and his people produced an intelligence report that claimed Iraq had been building WMDs, chemical and biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. Based on this report, which was mainly false, approval for war was granted. Now, the only thing left was the UN process, which the USA had no patience for. In November 2002, the UN Security Council passed a resolution 1441, which was a measure to give Iraq last chance to comply with the disarmament obligations. This was to show that Iraq had no WMDs. Hans Blix headed a team of UN weapons inspectors in Iraq between November 2002 and March 2003. And during this time, they conducted 900 inspections at more than 500 sites and locations. They did not find any chemical or biological weapons or any nuclear programs. But the US and its allies really wanted their war. Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, was sent to the UN. He came with photos of what was claimed to be mobile weapons facilities. He also presented a vial of anthrax, which was to solidify the claims that Iraq was developing biological weapons.
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. None of this should come as a surprise to any of us. Terrorism has been a tool used by Saddam for decades. Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name. And this support continues The nexus of poisons and terror is new. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination is lethal. With this track record, Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies. Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time and a place and in a manner of his choosing, at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond? The United States will not and cannot run that risk with the American people. Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option, not in a post-September 11th world.
But this is in contrast to what the inspectors reported. Colin insisted that Iraq had violated its last opportunity, and therefore he had justification to
Iraq
invade.
still poses a threat, and Iraq still remains in material breach. Indeed, by its failure to seize on its one last opportunity to come clean and disarm, Iraq has put itself in deeper material breach and closer to the day when it will face serious consequences for its continued defiance of this council. My colleagues, we have an obligation to our citizens. We have an obligation to this body to see that our resolutions are complied with. We wrote 1441 not in order to go to war. We wrote 1441 to try to preserve the peace. We wrote 1441 to give Iraq one last chance. Iraq is not so far taking that one last chance. We must not shrink from whatever is ahead of us. We must not fail in our duty and our responsibility to the citizens of the countries that are represented by this body.
US and its allies sought another resolution, giving Iraq an ultimatum of up to March 17th. But this resolution did not gain support, and the USA decided to abandon the UN process. Now Bush and his people had his war.
Whatever the figures, without doubt, one of the largest gatherings, let alone protest rallies, in English history.
Fellow citizens, events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing. For their own safety, all foreign nationals, including journalists and inspectors, should leave Iraq immediately. Fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
We are determined to join other countries to deprive Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. Its chemical and biological weapons, which even in minute quantities are capable of causing death and destruction on a mammoth scale.
On Tuesday night, I gave the order for British forces to take part in military action in Iraq. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? to remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. I know this course of action has produced deep divisions of opinion in our country. But I know also the British people will now be united in sending our armed forces our thoughts and prayers. They are the finest in the world, and their families and all of Britain can have great pride in them.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
The US would go ahead to occupy Iraq for almost a decade, and during this time, no chemical weapons, biological weapons, or nuclear facilities were found.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't.
During this war, almost 500,000 Iraqis lost their lives. Also, throughout the war, many human rights abuses and war crimes were committed. These included beatings, electrocution, mock executions, and sexual assaults. Colin Powell would later admit that the intelligence he presented was misleading.
And now the former Secretary of State says the American government got it wrong.
When I presented that information, it was information that the president believed in, information that my colleagues in government believed in the national security world, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, Dr. Rice. It was information that the United Kingdom and other nations believed in. It was evidence that persuaded the Congress of the United States to pass overwhelmingly a resolution of support if the president decided that military action was required. And so that's the basis upon which I presented it. But it turned out, as we discovered later, that a lot of the sourcing that had been attested to by the intelligence community was wrong. And 6 months later, the intelligence community is still standing behind their original judgments, even though nothing has been found. I understood the consequences of that failure, and as I've said on many occasions, I deeply regret that the information, some of the information, not all of it, some of the information I presented, which was multi-source, was wrong.
This story goes to show how the world runs, and how a few people hold the key to the world, and how these few people can alter the course of history and events. This is also a story of how the US and its allies got away with war crimes, as there was no evidence of what was claimed to be the reason for this invasion.
Let me begin by saying we were almost all wrong, and I certainly include myself here. It turns out we were all wrong, probably in my judgment, and that is most disturbing.
The estimate of the Iraqis who've died is astronomical. I mean, some figures say 600,000, some say more, impossible to know. Do you not have any regrets about Iraq?
No, I don't.